Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. I've so much enjoyed the first half of this meeting. It's been fantastic. But I've had that sort of growing sense of I might be here on a kind of fraudulent basis because I've got no slides and I'm not going to talk to you about digital either. So many apologies for that. And if that's a real problem, then perhaps leave now rather than hiss later. But I think I thought my brief was, and I'm apologizing to Reefer if it wasn't quite this, but I think I was asked to talk about passion and about creativity and about big ideas. So if you can forgive that there isn't a direct necessarily link that I've made, although I'm sure you will, to the digital economy, then that's fine. And what I wanted to talk about, you probably won't be that surprised to hear, is about climate change. But I want to approach it in perhaps a slightly different way. I want to talk about it in quite a personal way and to try to just spend a bit of time reflecting on why it is that we don't actually, come up with the action that is so clearly needed on climate change. And in the course of what I'm going to say, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the women who've inspired me and some of the things that they've said. But actually, the starting point for me was a film made by a wonderful woman called Franny Armstrong called The Age of Stupid that you might have seen. It was out a few years back. And it's basically a film that starts with a premise of some kind of climate catastrophe, and the actor Pete Postlethwaite plays the sole survivor of some kind of climate catastrophe. And he's there on his own looking through reels of news feed and genuine news feed from around the world from the last 10 or 20 years. So he's looking at hurricanes in the States and floods in Bangladesh and all of this evidence of climate change. And basically, he says, in words that still make the hairs go up on the back of my neck, he says, why is it, knowing what we knew then, we didn't act when there was still time? And to me, that is just literally the overwhelming question of our time. Why is it? It's not as if we don't know that climate change is happening. It's not as if the evidence isn't there, and it isn't as if it would be impossible to address it if we could just muster the political will. And so I spend an awful lot of my time restlessly in bed at night trying to go to sleep, but actually thinking about, how do we generate that political will? How do we ensure that we don't go down in history as the species that spent all its time monitoring its own extinction rather than taking active steps to try to avoid it? So I'm going to talk about climate change, but not so much the facts and figures of how fast it's happening, not so much about the number of parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, not about emission scenarios and carbon budgets and Annex I countries, not even that much actually about the policies we urgently need to get off this collision course we're on with climate catastrophe, but more about actually how climate change makes us feel, rather than how we think about it or how we rationalize it. And my big idea is actually quite simple, that if we decide that we want a different kind of future, if we feel that inside as well as knowing it in our heads, then simply having made that kind of commitment to the future will help us overcome some of the obstacles currently in the way of achieving it. And so in terms of that sense of how we feel about it, it feels to me that if we are to muster the action that is so desperately needed, then we need to center ourselves in some of that emotional stuff that so very rarely gets talked about. We need to have the courage to look the crisis in the face and genuinely connect with it on an emotional basis. Because academically, we know when we get told many times that, yes, if we exceed 2 degrees warming, then that is extremely dangerous. But how does it really feel to think that actually our kids and our grandkids and the species, the wonderful species that we share this most extraordinary planet with, how is it to actually feel that that is in jeopardy and that we might be literally putting all of that at risk? And I wanted to just reflect actually back when I first heard last year that there'd been a record loss of summer sea ice and that the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere were at their highest peak for possibly 800,000 years. And actually, hearing that literally made me feel as if I'd been kicked in the stomach. I felt incredibly winded. I felt incredibly tearful. And I wanted to share with you actually quite a long quote, so I hope you'll forgive me, but it is such a wonderful passage, and it's from Zadie Smith, another of my heroines. And she wrote so beautifully about this in the New York Review of Books earlier this year. And so I just wanted to quote what she says about feeling this stuff. She says, there is the scientific and ideological language for what's happening to the weather, but there are hardly any intimate words. Is that surprising? People in mourning tend to use euphemism, likewise the guilty and ashamed. The most melancholy of all the euphemisms, the new normal. It's the new normal, I think, as a beloved pear tree, half drowned, loses its grip on the earth and falls over. The train line to Cornwall washes away, the new normal. We can't even say the word abnormal to each other out loud. It reminds us of what came before. Better to forget what was once normal, the way season followed season, with a temperate charm only the poets appreciated. This will no doubt look very peculiar to my 7-year-old granddaughter. I don't expect she will forgive me, but it might be useful for her to get a glimpse into the mindset, if only for the purposes of comprehension. What shall I tell her? Her teachers will have already explained what was happening to the weather. In 2014, it was an inconvenient truth politically, financially, but that's perfectly obvious even now. A global movement of the people might have forced it onto the political agenda no matter what the cost. What she will want to know is why this movement took so long to materialize. So I might say to her, look, the thing you have to appreciate is that we've just been through a century of relativism and deconstruction in which we were informed that most of our fondest held principles were either uncertain or simple wishful thinking. And in many areas of our lives, we'd already been asked to accept that nothing is essential and everything changes, and that this had taken the fight out of us somewhat. And then it's important to remember that we thought we couldn't change the climate. That is, we always knew we could do a great deal of damage to the planet, but even the most hubristic among us had not imagined we would ever be able to fundamentally change its rhythms and character. Just as a child who has screamed all day at her father still doesn't expect to see him lie down on the kitchen floor and weep. Now, do you think that'll get me off the hook with my slightly tiresome and judgmental future granddaughter? I worry. Oh, what have we done? It's a biblical question, and we do not seem to be able to pull ourselves out of its familiarity, essentially its religious cycle of shame and denial and self-flagellation. This is why, I shall tell my granddaughter, the apocalyptic scenarios did not help. The terrible truth is we had a profound historical attraction to apocalypse. In the end, the only thing that could create the necessary traction in our minds was the intimate loss of the things we loved, like when the seasons changed in our beloved little island. Or the day I went into an Italian garden in early July with its owner, a woman in her 80s, and upon seeing the scorched yellow earth and withered roses, and hearing what only really old people will confess, in all my years I've never seen anything like it, I found my mind finally beginning to turn from the elegiac, what have we done, to the practical, what can we do? And I quote at such length because I think she so beautifully demonstrates that transition from the elegiac to the practical. And it just seems to me that perhaps one of the reasons we haven't mustered more action on this agenda is because we haven't centered ourselves enough in the elegiac in order to get the energy from that to put into the practical. But if facing the true horror of what we are doing to our climate is a prerequisite to generating the political will to act, to move from the elegiac to the practical, then how do we equip ourselves to face it? And I would submit that we can't do it without a huge amount of hope. The kind that requires clarity, seeing the troubles in the world and imagining what might lie behind those situations that are perhaps not inevitable and immutable. And I'm just being a bit self-indulgent here, but I wanted to make another quotation from another wonderful woman called Rebecca Solnit, who is a fantastic environmental activist and who writes so passionately about hope. Because for me, hope isn't the vision of hope perhaps that a poet like Emily Dickinson has when Emily Dickinson talks about hope is a thing with feathers on, that is in one's soul. And to me, I'm a bit worried that thing with feathers on sounds a little bit vulnerable. I want something a bit stronger. And that's why I love this quote from Rebecca Solnit. She says, "To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it's the opposite of fear. For to live is to risk. I say all this because hope is not like a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means that another world might be possible. Not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future makes the present inhabitable. Anything could happen, and whether we act or not has everything to do with it. I love that idea of the axe, because I think we need that kind of hope. And actually, one of the reasons I remain resolutely hopeful is that you're still here tonight. All of you who think a good night out is a Thursday evening listening to people talking about their big ideas, that's hopeful. All of you who recognize that, actually we are the people that we're waiting for. That already many of you are doing what you can in your lives to bring sustainability a bit closer. People who recognize that increased environmental efficiency is part of the answer, but it's not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Technology is part of the answer, but it's not all of the answer. And when we do talk about technology, it has to be appropriate technology. That might be, well, it won't be controversial here, but you know what I mean? There's that lovely quote about H.G. Wells when he said, "Whenever I see an adult on a bicycle, I no longer despair for the future of the human race." I think that's a lovely reflection. But you are already embracing the transformational behavior change that will help us overcome the fear that we have and turn it into hope and then solutions. And I'm thinking of things like the transition town movement, the new enthusiasm for allotments, the appetite for local food, the community-owned energy co-ops, and indeed one of the wonderful things I just heard earlier from Kate was this idea of the library. Did I just hit that? Never mind, sorry. It's a good thing to be reminded of. About the idea that when you're just about to go and buy something else on Amazon Hiss, you suddenly have a little thing that pops up and reminds you that you actually could go and try and get that from the local library. Those are fantastic kinds of solutions. And so I just want to spend a few moments just reflecting on, given that there are good solutions out there, then why don't we take them more simply? And I think there are lots of reasons. There's the power and the vested interests of the fossil fuel companies, who are increasingly not simply lobbying government, but as I found out in Parliament, they're actually inside Whitehall themselves. They are embedded in the civil service, writing the policy themselves. Or maybe one of the reasons we don't act is because we've believed some of the rhetoric of the greenest government ever. We might have perhaps suspended a little skepticism and think, well, maybe that's all in hand and we don't need to worry about it. Or maybe it's because people are just struggling just to get by, and that's completely understandable, trying to cope with the latest obscenity from a government that is intent on making the poorest and most vulnerable pay the highest price for an economic crisis that was none of their making. Trying to keep a roof over their heads while housing benefit is cut, trying to live a dignified life while disability payments are being slashed. Or maybe it's because we're just being so bombarded by so many advertisements, around 3,000 every day, one every 15 seconds of our waking lives, all of them basically telling us that we need to go out and do some more consuming, that we're not beautiful enough, we're not sexy enough unless we go and get the latest gadget. In the wonderful words of Professor Tim Jackson, they're basically trying to persuade us to spend money we don't have, to buy things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't care about. And when you put it like that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But even if we have confronted all of those challenges and decided that we will act, there are still obstacles. Lack of progress on climate change is exacerbated, I think, by this mixture of vested interests, of political paralysis, of civic ambiguity. Many of the obstacles we need to overcome in order to create the future we want are about power and where it lies. So overcoming those obstacles can indeed be a real test of hope. And so too can be the relentless bad news, yet one more species that has become extinct, yet one more line in the sand we've crossed, or a record that's been broken. This week it was the news that across the globe, May and August this year were the hottest ever recorded, and September is lining up to join that list as well. Behind the undeniable pleasure of unseasonably balmy weather is the reality that our climate is changing beyond recognition with irreversible consequences, and that brings with it renewed senses of urgency about tackling the climate crisis. So hope is vital, but alone it won't cut it. We need radical creative thinking that will deliver radical creative solutions. And thankfully, there are pioneering people out there who are beginning to lay the ground. And I'm thinking about some of the different kinds of organizations, even as someone like B&Q, who is now, proposing shifting from selling items such as power drills to selling the actual use of them. In other words, rather than focusing on selling a drill, they're focusing on what the customer needs, which is usually, unless you're a bit of a perennial driller, an occasional hole in the wall. And so B&Q can provide that same service without the same resource intensity. Whipcar and its French equivalent Buzzcar allow people to rent their own cars to others while they're not in use. So the car that sits outside your workplace maybe for 7 or 8 hours while you're at work could actually be rented out to other people during that period, and they could use it. Another example of innovation is a plaster-shaped MP3 player, a skinny player. It looks like a plaster that you might put on a cut. It plays music and it's powered by human body heat and has resource efficiency at its core. Looking a bit further into this, there seems to be no end of cool companies pioneering dramatically new approaches to doing business, often doing what's known as disruptive innovation. They're throwing out of the window the box labeled success in business means burning more energy to churn out more stuff to sell to more people. Disruption in some cases, like Skype and Spotify, means stripping out a whole chunk of resources once seen as essential, whether that's needing an aeroplane to fly to the other end of the world for a face-to-face meeting, or a bunch of CDs to listen to music. Carpet tile manufacturer Interfloor has designed a tile collection by recovering and remanufacturing flooring. Made from 100% recycled yarn, the products are an example of closed-loop manufacturing, as they're made from pre- and post-consumer waste and include much less yarn than previous ranges. And this is almost taken to its climax, in a sense, by the outdoor clothes specialist Patagonia. They've gone as far as running an advert with a picture of a jacket, and the headline above it says, "Don't buy this jacket." Now, the underlying message is value what you have, come back to us when you need, by implication, a high quality and therefore high priced replacement. But if it works, it could lead to Patagonia making more profits while net consumption of resources overall is reduced. Now, naysayers will rightly point out that Patagonia didn't get to be a $400 million company by not selling clothing. That is certainly true. But I think those same pundits perhaps might not be aware, for example, that Patagonia is still a family-run business owned by Yvonne and Melinda Chouinard. And Yvonne wrote in the introduction to his autobiography, and I quote, "Patagonia exists to challenge conventional wisdom and present a new style of responsible business. We believe the accepted model of capitalism that necessitates endless growth deserves the blame for the destruction of nature and must be displaced." Well, I couldn't agree more with that. And that brings me to one of my final points, really, which is that in terms of addressing this challenge of climate change, we have to accept that the dominant model of ever-increasing economic growth is one that cannot be sustainable into the future. A lot of physicists and others will go to great lengths to try to explain that it is possible to go on growing in an infinite fashion on a planet of finite resources. But actually, as Kenneth Boulding points out, over 50 years ago, anyone who believes exponential economic growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And we can certainly be more efficient, and we must be more efficient and use the best of our technology to be more efficient. But the bottom line is, with a growing population, with a population in the South that rightly expects to have a higher standard of living than they've had to date, and at the same time, when even if each widget that we have, each airplane we fly on, even if each one of those is becoming more efficient, the fact that there are more planes in the sky and more widgets in our homes means that overall energy use, resource use is still on an upward trajectory. So that means that we absolutely need to challenge some of the basic building blocks of how our economy works. Again, quoting Professor Tim Jackson, he says, "Questioning growth is deemed to be the act of lunatics, idealists, and revolutionaries, but question it we must." And I point out that I'm not the lunatic, I am the idealist and the revolutionary. But he points out there's nothing natural about our current economic arrangements. They've been consciously designed to achieve a simple objective, which is growth. But actually, in so many ways, growth isn't actually making us any happier. It's creating dysfunctional and unequal societies. And if it continues in the same way, it will make large parts of the planet unfit for human habitation. Unfortunately, research underlines that happiness and well-being do not depend on endless economic growth. That actually, even though over the last 30 years, economic growth has more than doubled, GDP has more than doubled, if you look at all of the evidence about whether or not people feel happier, whether they feel more hopeful for the future, whether they think their kids are going to have a better quality of life than they did, then on those measures of well-being, then the data is very different. It shows actually either data has flatlined over those 30 years or on some indicators it's come down. And so that means that we need to completely reshape the way we think about our economy. And I want to just make clear, particularly at a time of recession, that a kind of a steady state economy, an economy, in other words, that isn't based on more and more growth, is not the same as an economy in recession. The current recession, where growth is stalled and people are thrown out of work and misery is compounded, is not a prototype steady state economy. And Professor Herman Daly explains this with a nice analogy about aeroplanes and helicopters. He explains an aeroplane is designed for forward movement, and if it tries to hover, it crashes. So it's not really helpful to think of a helicopter as an aeroplane that has failed to move forward. It's a different thing. It had different design motivations in mind. It is designed to hover. Likewise, a steady state isn't designed to growth. That doesn't mean there's no economic activity. And maybe the phrase dynamic equilibrium has better been coined to try to capture this sense of activity without more and more resource-based growth. Steady state behavior is a system that permits qualitative development, but not aggregate quantitative growth. Or in another way of thinking about it, growth is more of the same stuff, development is the same amount of better stuff. And so it's clear that we need a whole range of policies that are going to be able to deliver that kind of outcome. And they're quite radical policies. They might be policies, for example, that would include us all working fewer hours each week. We'd have to make sure everyone still had enough to live on. But what a balmy situation we have when some people are working 80, 90 hours a week and getting ill from it, and others are still desperately trying to find work. We need ecological tax reform. That's just a long way of saying that basically prices have to tell the ecological truth. And so when you're buying something more locally that hasn't been transported from one end of the world to the other using finite resources of oil which cause climate change, you know, your local produce should be cheaper than the stuff that's come from the other end of the world. There should not be the perverse signals that our current pricing leaves with us. We've got to do so much more, and I'm not going to tell you about it because I suspect that time is beginning to run out. But what I will do is say that actually the hopeful thing about all of this, to go back to where I started from, is to say that an economy that is genuinely sustainable, I think, has every chance of being an economy where we're much happier. That actually if we got off this kind of treadmill that so many people, not in this room, but in many other rooms around the city and the world, where there is that sense of having to work harder and harder to get more money to pay for higher mortgages and so forth. We've got to re-look at this and ask ourselves the prior question about what do we actually think of our purpose as human beings, which is a very big question to leave on a Thursday night at about 10 to 9. But I'm just going to leave you with actually my very favorite cartoon, because it kind of sums up what I'm trying to say. And actually, if I'd had the wit, I would have brought a slide, and I haven't, so maybe someone can do a nice app with the slide. But essentially, the cartoon I want you to imagine is of a professor in a university standing in front of all of his students. And on the whiteboard behind him, he's listed all of the advantages that could come from moving to this sustainable society, this way of living that is not putting our planet at risk. And on that whiteboard, he's put all of the advantages. So things like, you know, more affordable public transport, or homes that are properly fuel efficient and keep us warm, or more local food, more allotments, more cooperative energy, more time with our kids. And he has that list there, and then there's one of his students in the audience has a speech bubble coming out of their mouth saying, but what if climate change is a hoax and we've created a better world for no reason? Thank you.